Others are going to be joining later on in the lecture. So I guess we can just start now, and then as people come in, we'll just admit them into the Zoom. So welcome everyone. My name is Sidika, and on behalf of DWG, we're so happy to see all of you here tonight. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that many of us are gathered here digitally and are calling from stolen Indigenous land. I, as well as the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism, are located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We offer this acknowledgement as a reminder of our shared responsibility to the land and acknowledge how grateful we are to have the opportunity to be present on this territory. For tonight's event, we ask that you keep your mics muted for the main panel of the discussion, but we will have the opportunity to unmute ourselves at the end during our Q&A session with the audience. Today's event will be recorded and posted to DWG's website for future reference. DWG is a student-led working group made up of BIPOC students, allies, and faculty supporters from the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism. Our working group was formed to hold the school and faculty accountable to move towards a more equitable learning environment. We stand on 3 pillars, which are advocacy, education, and community support. And we're very lucky to be addressing these 3 pillars tonight with our 3 speakers and all of you. So just pass it on to Angela.
Yeah, and so just to give a little brief explanation about tonight's event, it's called Untold Histories, Storytelling Through Heritage, and we named it that because we hopefully are going to dedicate the space to expanding conversations on like heritage and histories that have stood at the foreground of our education. And we hope to learn or unlearn certain narratives and have these interdisciplinary perspectives comment on things around us, and whether that's intangible histories, tangible monuments, and so on. So to introduce our guests briefly, our moderator is Dr. Tammy Gaber, and she is the director and an associate professor at the McEwen School of Architecture. We're really excited to have someone who works at and researches on design leading the conversation tonight. Also joining her is Dr. Kahente Horn-Miller, and she's an associate professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. Her research and interest in Indigenous methodology, Indigenous women, identity politics, and so much more will be shown, I'm sure, tonight. Last but not least is we have Riley Yesno. Oh my God, sorry. University of Toronto graduate and upcoming PhD student. She wears many hats. She's a writer, researcher, public speaker, lots of Googling. That there's a huge list. Her ability to connect with young people or even a wide range of audiences inspires all of us to ask questions and challenge existing systems. I'm sure as the conversation continues, we'll get to know a lot of them more. And yeah, I'm just babbling at this point. So Tammy, take it away. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I would like to add to the land acknowledgement as I'm coming in from another place. And I'd like to acknowledge that the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850 and recognize that where I live and where I teach, McEwen School of Architecture is located on the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabeg, and the city of Greater Sudbury also includes the traditional lands of the Wanapatei First Nation. And people can address me as she or her. So that's just a... and I'd like to begin. I'm very excited tonight because our 2 panelists have so much to share with us, so much experience with respect to really kind of advocating, right, in spatial realms. And so what I'd like to begin with the first question for each of you, Dr. Kahente Horn-Miller and future Dr. Riley Yesno, who have generously allowed me to refer to them as Kahente and Riley. The first question is, well, you know, thinking about this idea of being pushed out of education, of stories, of opportunities and physical places, how can some of these spaces become inaccessible? How are they inaccessible or hostile?
Kahente yujats, akskare wat ge ni I kanyak ke haga, neo enjoto. What can waradun tanasuaguego. I am here. My name is Kahente Hornmiller. I'm Bear Clan, and I am from Kahnawake, and I bring greetings. I am also a guest here in unceded Algonquin territory, and I've been treated very well. Now that is the traditional greeting, and in doing that, in multiple opportunities across, in the work that I do here at Carleton, and when I'm online or when I'm at other places, I always acknowledge and make the space for doing it in a traditional way. I'm placing myself. So I think that is a good place to start as we engage in this understanding of, what does it mean to be pushed out, but also on the other side, what does it mean to make space and to, in a way, and calmly, in a way, in a diplomatic way, make the space again for our voices and for acknowledging the way that we do things as Indigenous peoples in these places that were not made for us. So just by example, I show you one way to make that space, to bring us back.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Ani bojo rali Yesno Indigenous Yamatong First Nation and Tonche, Tegronton and Nujaba, Ni Minweya Kintash. Hello, I just introduced myself in my traditional language, which is Ojibwe and Anishinaabe-Moan. I said that my name is Riley Yesno. I'm from Yamatong First Nation. And if we're looking at Ontario geography, if anybody knows where Thunder Bay is, you go 400 some kilometers northeast, and then you're in Yamatong territory in Treaty 9. I grew up there and in Thunder Bay, and I'm currently living and working in Toronto. Which is my homeland, still shared with the Haudenosaunee and many other Indigenous folks from across Turtle Island. And so I'm very happy to be calling you from here. And so I guess to begin answering, because I don't know that I can come to a full answer to the question of, just the numerous ways that we can be pushed out, but in turn make space again. I love that. I wrote it down, that making space being the opposite of being pushed out, I think is such a good point. But, I think that growing up in colonial Canada, right? Like there are numerous ways as an Indigenous person, as a young person, as a queer person, that you face that tension of trying to force you to exit a space if especially you can't confine to certain colonial boxes and structures. And so that's something that, certainly I faced many times. I think like a lot of the time in my personal experience, like I look like a really good Native person for for organizations, institutions, and whatever to come to, as I'm white, I speak without an accent, I'm educated through the colonial way, and so because of that, like a lot of opportunity and space is allotted for me. But then when you get into those spaces and challenge them, is where the pushback really begins to start to be felt. I think Indigenous people generally, young people, queer people again, face a lot of these narratives of, comply, be grateful to just simply have a seat at the table. It took me a very long time to cultivate the knowledge that power doesn't come from a seat at a table. It comes from your agency to occupy that seat as you see fit. And so that's a lesson and an experience that I think is very universally resonant among Indigenous folks that I know. And so that's a tip of an iceberg, but I would love to hear more from you, Dr. Hornmiller, as well.
Well, when I think about making space, I think I go back to right from the very beginning of my education where, you're very fortunate. I went through my entire university education without having any Indigenous professors. So it was constantly a situation where I was the Indian in the room, right? And I'm sure you've experienced that, where you're called upon to speak on behalf of, right? And fortunately, I come from a people that we have a long history of diplomacy. And being involved in the Longhouse, you begin to understand, what that means, how to use your voice in the right way, and how to conduct yourself, and the kind of language that you use in order to make that space. Because, and this is what I teach my children. I'm a mother to 4 and a grandmother to 1. And I say, you can get involved in social justice issues, but you have to back yourself up. You have to know the history, know your history, and speak kindly and softly. And that's when people will listen, right? When we start yelling at each other, that's when people shut down. So, through my education, I would approach my professors and other students in a way that I treated them as equals. I never placed them above. I was that issue of power again, right? I claimed my seat, essentially. And I learned to speak with an even tone, looking them in the eye, learning essentially how to speak the colonizer's language, right? Using the theory, the method, the things that they taught me through my education, to communicate who I am. And so I took the opportunity at every chance in all of my classes to shift and change and make that space in those classes for others to understand who I am as Kanien'kehá:ka, and more widely as part of the Haudenosaunee. And so, I always think back to that, and it has served me well in terms of giving me, teaching me how to take that into a professional setting. Right now at Carleton, I'm the inaugural Assistant Vice President, Indigenous Initiatives, right? And I'm here because I can speak, because people, listen. I never use a loud tone. I speak kindly. I think about all the issues. I deliberate, or I encourage critical engagement on the issues. There's all these things that I learned in the Longhouse among my people that serve me well in this other setting of the academic world, right? And also the professional world. And really at its core, it is about making that space, making sure that we are heard. And I teach this as well to my students, where I do consensus-based decision-making, where I teach them how to listen to each other, right? And I think that's another crucial thing here, is in order to find that space, in order to make that space, we all have to learn how to engage with each other and listen to each other and speak kindly to each other, because then we will hear. So that's what I have to contribute at the moment. I have lots more to say, but
I thought that was excellent. I loved your point about listening. It reminded me of this teaching I got from a Haida elder a number of years ago, who was talking about leadership generally, and they were saying that that in their nation, like I think I hear something. Oh, okay, seems to be gone. But they were saying that in their nation, that their leaders are taught to listen twice as much as they speak. And that was a fundamental part of teaching leadership for them. And it was something that always really stuck with me and that I try to really embody. So I think that's a really resonant. Yeah, I was thinking about, as you're talking about your journey, I started to think a little bit about like, where would I cite like a beginning for myself? And I think a lot of the times where I peg like a leadership journey beginning, it's when I was a teenager and I was in high school, and I was like first appointed to the Prime Minister's Youth Council. Prime Minister at the time was Justin Trudeau still, so I'm showing you my age here, how young I am. But so I was appointed to the Prime Minister's Youth Council when I was 16 years old.
Mhm.
And at this time, like I had grown up in, with these narratives and with these assertions that the colonial institution was like the way to make change. It was the most effective vehicle for change. And in order to change anybody's mind, you just have to get there and get those people in power to listen. And so I went, and like, I was so starstruck. I thought it was the most amazing thing ever. And I had a very romantic idea of what change making was, I realized once I got there. And I very quickly had all of like, this facade sort of start to crumble around me when I saw the way young people, and especially the racialized young people in the room, were dismissed and were undermined and were told, explicitly to be grateful just to have a seat in this table. How many people would want to be there, and all these things. And so it was like this real light bulb shift moment for me in a couple of years, where I was like, oh, I have to totally reinvent how I am going to exist in this space, or how I'm going to exist in these spaces if I want to even continue here. The other part being, what is the best theory of change? Where do I believe truly that if it's not this institution, where change can happen and come from, and how can I best use my gifts there? And the other thing I really learned was like how to take up that power, and that lesson that I mentioned about the seat and about agency. And so it's been a long journey from there to there, even though that wasn't that, in years wise that long ago. I think about, I can see when I look back at some videos, I remember the thought process that I was using and implementing to stop from that push, right? I felt like there was always this tension and this compromise. So for the Prime Minister's Youth Council, I tried my hardest, used my nicest tone, spoke in a way that I thought young people were supposed to speak, and still, received that response. And so then I was like, okay, this isn't the way. So I thought, hey, I'll find a way to say my points, but say it in a way that's really palatable and it's really understanding and empathetic for non-Indigenous and non-racialized folks. And so I did a TED Talk in 2019 where I talk about Canadian identity, and how this idea of like a nice Canadian and nice Canada, doesn't really exist, and it's like a lie, and all these things. And I got a lot of support for it, but I can't even watch it now because as I go back, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I can just see myself trying to make sure that from any angle, like nobody could point out that I wasn't being too hostile, or I wasn't being too critical, or too anything like this that would get me some pushback, right? And so it was still balancing white folks' feelings over it was what I felt to be a truth. And only in the past few years, I think, have I taken in this journey to be able to speak truly authentically, to find spaces that serve me and places that do not. But that is like, even like a half a decade long journey from there to there. And I think like I was very lucky that I got to start it at 16 years old. And so I'm really, just to say that I think that like there's still so much, that's a journey that I think is replicated in the lives of many young Indigenous people, young racialized people generally. And I'm also like gushing to hear about like the things that you're teaching your children and your grandchildren from the Longhouse, because I think, that's the sort of guidance that would have been so helpful in my journey and so many others. And so, yeah, I think that was really, really beautiful and powerful. Yeah, Miigwech for listening also.
Thank you. It's so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. And I agree. I wrote it down too. I love this idea of making space. Thank you for so generously articulating that, Kahente and Riley. And I really appreciate that. And the kind of the beginnings of how you started to make space for yourselves, and by extension start to make space for others by kind of paving the way, by challenging the status quo. This is really important. And I'm curious, because I'm from the vantage point of someone in design, I'm curious about maybe your experience approaching physical spaces and physical built environments, and what challenges have you come up against, and have you at all advocated for change within your physical environment?
Yeah, so We did the extensive consultations at Carleton to inform the Kinamaguan final report, where we came up with the committee that came up with 41 calls to action. In there, there's advocacy for spaces that encourage other ways of teaching, so Indigenous pedagogical methods, right? So this would mean with movable furniture, if we were to have an Inuk professor, they would be able to clear the floor and put down the cardboard and start eating, cutting up and sharing country food. It was that kind of thinking that informed, and requests that informed the calls to action. And so that's something we're actually just at the beginning stages of figuring out how do we put that into action, right? So it's there, but the university itself we had unanimous consent on the unanimous approval of the 41 calls to action, both from the Senate and from the Board of Governors. So it's there, and now we just have to put it into action. So that's one place where I think in the long run, when we start to create these spaces where we can teach authentically, right? I mean, there's only so much we can do in our classrooms when we teach, such as using consensus-based decision-making to encourage students and teach them how to engage with each other, how to talk to each other. What does Indigenous governance really mean? Alongside language and land programming, or land-based learning as well, right? So it's I find that oftentimes these spaces that are created for us as educators are really limiting, right? So it's a challenge to think outside the box and say, okay, how am I going to take what I do in the classroom that is effective and bring that into, let's say, the online environment? I created an online course out of my Indigenous Studies 1000 back in 2015. And I found that I was able to incorporate some of what I was, and the way that I was teaching in my courses. So I had, obviously the lecture portions, but then I invited knowledge keepers to, which I included interviews with them to, in a sense, make it alive. So we call this jini jiwan in our language, which means to make it alive in the mind. And so I used Indigenous philosophy to inform the way that I was creating this online course. And then also too, when I structured how the students would relate to each other in the online environment, I created smaller groups. The assignments I gave them where they had to interact with each other and create a sense of community, right? And then we were also able to do consensus-based decision-making online using the tools that we have in the online environment. So, I translated that, what worked really well, into bundles, collaborative Indigenous learning bundles, which I've been creating for the last 2.5, 3 years, which are in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so what these are is they make the space in the classroom for Indigenous knowledge, right? So we walk in, the professors walk into this room, it's a box, there's seats, there's students in those seats, there's a projector, there's a screen, right? And it's always the same. But what is different is the knowledge that we bring into our classrooms. So when a non-Indigenous person would like to bring Indigenous knowledge in as in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final calls, they can look to the collaborative Indigenous learning bundles, and we teach them how to make that bridge between what's in the bundle and what's in their course. And so these bundles are applicable across disciplines, and some of the audience tonight will have worked with these bundles here at Carleton, and they know that experience. They know how challenging it can be, but also too, what it is it's taking that box that we have to teach in and making it our own, right? That's essentially what we're doing when we teach using Indigenous pedagogical methods. And so what I'm doing with these bundles is I do there's the lecture portion, there's the knowledge keeper portion, which once again makes it alive. And then the assignments and the readings are all ones that are vetted and used by myself and others, Indigenous faculty, to bring that knowledge alive and make sure that the students are able to understand it and, you know, be graded and all the normal things. But what we've done is this whole project is informed with Indigenous philosophy, more specifically philosophy from my own people. And so it's about creating that, changing that space, creating that space, even though we are limited by the four walls.
Wonderful, thank you. Riley, did you want to reflect on this idea of, you know, changing the environment that you're in any way, or thinking about the physical environment?
Totally. I think that's a lovely question. I'm going to steal one example from somebody else and then one my own. The one that's my own first that I first think about has a lot to do, and I think it was mentioned briefly at the beginning, you know, statues, monuments, these sorts of things. So I first wrote and pitched to all of like national media in Canada. I think it was in 2015. I said, you know, the statues of John A. Macdonald have to go, and the statues of Egerton Ryerson have to go, and the like. Yeah. And, you know, I shopped this around, and all of the editors at the time told me that nobody was interested in this, that it was something nobody wanted to talk about, and that, you know, if they did take it, that they had to like slash and chop like so much of it. And so that was only, you know, I guess going on 7 years ago. And now we're at a completely different place. And in that, you know, has been, I've done and also seen from others, you know, just incredible advocacy that gets you to that point, right? Like I first pitched this in 2015, but there had been people, you know, also saying those same things that gave me those ideas in the first place. There was, you know, conversations in boardrooms that I had at U of T, where I go to school, about, you know, no, it has to go. And conversations about, well, then how do you reconcile this? How do you reconcile this legacy with this legacy? And really, really tough, challenging things that over the years gave me like basically like a book of like, you know, language that I could come up with that was basically to say that no argument that anybody ever gave me about why these monuments should stay was compelling, that I found was compelling. So I basically had like a response to anything that would come up again and again and again. And once we had that, it was just saying it again and again and again until a critical mass of people, enough people and the right people, were able to hear that, understand it. And then we get to this place now, right? Where like Ryerson or X University, we're seeing a complete name change, where the statue of John A. Macdonald and schools and institutions across the country are reconfiguring this. And so I would like to think that I was part of that journey for a lot of places over the years. And it's one thing that I think about because, you know, when I first got to U of T at like 17, 18 years old, I left my community in the north, like by myself living in the city. And I get to this building, like if anybody's seen U of T campus, like it looks like just this like colonial castle, like with turrets and like, you know, anything that you could see at a Hogwarts would be at U of T. And so, you know, I get there and like, how daunting it is as an Indigenous student. In my community in Northern Ontario that I'm from, you know, Indigenous people are everywhere. Because of that, our art is everywhere. Signs have Anishinaabe, Moan as the alternate language. And then I got to U of T, right? And there was massive oil paintings of the Queen looking at me everywhere I went. And, you know, just this real reminder of colonialism in every corner that I could look. And so to do things like remove those statues and to put the new things in its place, Indigenous things in its place, I think is a really affirming thing to think that, you know, students will go to those universities and it won't be entirely remodeled, but bit by bit, there are those changes. And so that's something I think about in terms of my physical advocacy I've done in my physical space. And I'm sure we'll talk more about statues, but The other example I wanted to bring up was of Douglas Cardinal, the architect, who I think lots of folks are in Ottawa, right? And so would know his work. And he and I did a panel a couple years back now, pre-COVID, for TD about indigenizing cities. And he was at the keynote and was asked, you know, all of us were asked, what does an Indigenous city look like, or an indigenized city look like? And I said, you know, I really unfortunately feel like I don't really know what one looks like. I don't think I've ever seen one in my lifetime. And Harold said, or Douglas said, sorry, I have seen an Indigenous city in my lifetime, and it's only because I built it. But if I hadn't built it, I don't think I would have. Yeah. And he went on to explain how he worked with this Cree community in Quebec to go and build, to completely urban plan and build their new town. And he said it took him like a decade to do, to even plan it, because the way he did it was he went around and he had conversations for years with these elders to understand, okay, where do the ecosystems, what do the ecosystems look like at this season, at this season, at this season? Where do the animals migrate here? Where does the water touch here? And then with that knowledge, he built the city around and intertwined with all of those ecosystems and all of those, the natural world. He also built it with their community values in mind. So, you know, the children were all placed in the middle of the community with rings going outward. For elders would be next. And then, you know, people who would work in cities and had to get out easier. And so it was a way of him using their knowledge to be able to build a truly Indigenous city and an Indigenous place to live. And that to me, I was like, oh, in tears, you know, at the idea of it.
I've heard that. Yeah, I heard him talk about that. And it's really wonderful to hear it in more detail about it. He talked about that a few years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's on YouTube still, and if I can find it, I'll link it. His talk where he shows like even the maps and the plans he did. Yeah. And as I think about that, right, like all I could think about is Toronto, which is set up like a grid where they just plowed cement everywhere, where even my res, you know, right, where like they put us on the least arable land, like just plopped next to this lake in the middle of nowhere with no access to anything, and how different and how stark that is. And yeah, I think it's a really beautiful world making project that he undertook.
Yeah, I've been doing some work with a former graduate student of mine. She graduated, during COVID anyway. It's pretty phenomenal when our students graduate during a major worldwide pandemic, right? But what she was doing was working on looking at Ganyageha place names. And one of the main things that she found in, you know, excavating all these old maps, talking to community advisors, was that what she realized is that in order to really understand our naming systems and how we view the world and how we view the land and how is very much related to how we use it. And so in order to understand the traditional names of places, you have to be on the water, because the water is for our people, for the Kanien'kehá:ka, is our traditional roadway, right? And so because different kinds of people come through and use these spaces differently, these names don't remain the same, right? They carry a name for the people that use them. And so we've been working on a research project going to communities, teaching community people how to use this Nunallit online mapping system. And so what we do is we sit down and we look at old maps, but then we talk with elders and young community people and examine the words that are supposed to be associated with these places, and really do these reflect the oral history, the recorded history, you know, all of these things. And so what we do is we record them, but then we can put these in the maps. And so with it, if you think about it more widely, we're reclaiming that space, right? Because the Western mapping systems, the mapping tradition is all about you know, naming something because you've conquered it, right? So it's always about putting that flag down and putting that name down and saying, this is ours. And then two, it creates these boundaries, right? And so if you using this Nunalite system, what we can do is erase the boundaries and have people look at the map, look at the land the way that we should be looking at it, without these lines, without these boundaries, without these man-made divisions, right? And so when we work with the elders, what they do is they'll hash out a word, a name that's supposed to be associated with that. And then they think it through and they can see it in their mind. Jeannie, do you want again? And then they will look at the map and say, okay. And then they start to work that language to put the actual name into that place again. And so if you think about it, this is actually a sovereignty. This is because it's about reclaiming these spaces. Now we're planning on moving ahead with our project to include geotechnical engineers, so that, because most spaces, as we know, are manipulated, right? There's been human intervention. And so our traditional lands don't look the same. But if someone were to examine these spaces and say, well, yes, here, knowing our language and knowing our traditional names for it, they could say, yes, I can see where the human intervention has manipulated that space, and affirm that, okay, this is what it originally looked like, and this is how it was probably used. And so they can relate that space to our traditional names. And so it's a reclamation of those spaces. And in some ways it's very dangerous for, Canada, because it allows us to say, we know who we are, we know our relationship to these spaces, this is what these spaces mean to us, and here's proof that this is where we come from, right? And so once again, it's the manipulation of, or making that space, right, in the world, the space in the natural environment too. So it's not just buildings, it's not just statues, but it's also about, like Toronto, Toronto, right? Renaming, putting the traditional words back into these places, or indigenizing the words to reflect our traditional ways, the way that we name places and mark our spaces, right? So I think there's lots of different ways to do this. I think there's lots to, moving forward, there's lots to think about in terms of what are the other ways that we can do this.
Yeah, and I really love this. I love this idea of how language and visioning needs to come first. It comes before space, right? And this is something we can all understand, that, how you occupy space, how you, transcend it is, with the idea, with language, and with how you imagine it beforehand. And it's something certainly that, many members of the audience today can relate to, because in architecture, you have to kind of imagine things.
Yeah.
You have to put a name to them. You have to try different names to start to see, what the next steps forward are. I'd like to share as well, if it's possible. So I'm fortunate. I think one of the most important pedagogical thing I've done in my life has been to be one of the founding faculty at Laurentian University for the MacEwan School of Architecture. That's the most important thing I've ever done in my teaching career. And I say this because, in 2013, 6 faculty and a director got together without a building and we started a program, and integrated within the program from the beginning were Indigenous elders locally in every design studio, in many of our courses. Once the building went up, all of the signage was in Anishinaabe, English, and French. It is a tricultural school. We are still working. We know it's not perfect, but what's been special for me in addition to teaching is I've been learning. Since 2013, I've been a part of studios that, with Anishinaabeg elders, with knowledge keepers and elders, we've gone into the bush, we've collected birch bark, we've sewn the birch bark, we've created a wigwam in collaboration with the Indigenous Learning Center on main campus for the students. Our students have made many birch bark canoes, and it's not just about the thing we learn, it's how we learn.
Yep.
It's the pace, the language,
Mhm.
the interaction, the humanity, the humility. It is a tone and approach to teaching that to me was radical in comparison to every other mode of teaching I've been a part of. And this has been continuously humbling and educating for myself
Mhm.
over and over again. And I think it's it's a different tone to design education. And we've done our best to kind of always keep the tone away from competition and more towards collaboration, because not only do we work with specific elders and knowledge keepers, but Douglas Cardinal ran a graduate studio last year for us. Actually, I remember he gave the first lecture at our school when it opened, when we were using the basement of a senior citizen home. That's where we taught out of for the first 2 years. We taught out of a senior citizen home downtown Sudbury.
Yeah.
And he came, so we used the basement, but when Douglas Cardinal came, he lectured in the actual church because it was a senior citizen home with a church in it. And I'll never forget this because we were in the church and he was lecturing from the pulpit, and 90% of the audience were not architects because there still wasn't a full architecture school or the culture, right? So it was just everybody from Sudbury, lots of people from the community. And I have never been in an architecture lecture where people in unison were responding vocally. He was speaking and it was so powerful. And as the inaugural lecture, I'll never forget that moment. Like, it made it okay to teach in the basement for a couple of years, but it was, I just look back to these moments and this kind of sustained interaction and how we try to navigate. It's a question, I asked you this question because it's a question I continuously navigate, and I'm sure many of the people in the audience do, is how do we make space? How do we affect physical space,
Mhm.
right? How do we do it meaningfully? And this is something that has no silver bullet answer, right? We've been talking and thinking and collaborating and working on this, and listening to you, Kahente, describe how you transcended the physical limitations of your four walls and
Mhm.
how you were able to find a way online to transcend it. As an architect, that hurts, but it makes sense. And I'm happy you transcended it. But as an architect, that hurts because I'm like, okay, how can we transcend it? Or maybe another way to ask the question is, what's the ideal space to teach in? You mentioned movable chairs, but beyond the four walls, like, I mean, for us, a lot of our teaching is happening in the studio, in the wood shop, in the bush, outside. Like, a lot of our teaching is not confined. We
Yeah.
actually only have a lecture hall and one classroom in the whole building because everything else is happening more in
Yeah.
collaboration. But from your perspective and from what you, and I like that you tied teaching to space, right?
Mhm.
From
Mhm.
your perspectives of teaching, of learning, of spaces, what could be some of the more ideal spaces you imagine engaging in?
Yeah, well, we've, in grappling with that at Carleton, we did, we looked at this one place on campus that used to be an amphitheater, an outdoor amphitheater, right? So it's the usual, the benches going down, that sort of thing, with the circle in the middle. And we were asked, a committee was asked to come up with a plan to indigenize it, essentially. And so we started grappling with that question, I would say back in 2016, where we did a consultation. We went up to Kitagan-Zibi, Pikwakanagan, Aguizasne. We did on-campus consultations with students and faculty, supported by architects on campus who looked at, the origins of that space. Why did it end up being an amphitheater? What about all the flora, the fauna on that space, as a way to kind of set the stage and help us to understand, okay, what are we working with here? But in our consultations, what people were saying was this space had to be, because it was outside, that you needed to respect the environment. You had to respect the flora and the fauna that was already there, that either had been planted or existed there. You had to respect the fact that, you know, that and make it a usable space all year round, because we aren't limited really, you know, by the rain or the snow. We shouldn't be limited when we teach or when we learn by the natural elements. In fact, those should be very much included as we think through how to engage with the natural world in a way that where we can survive, essentially, right? But two, you know, there was lots of talk about, well, how do we communicate in this space? We are here, right? And so the idea was to include a mural. This space is surrounded by different buildings, so there's empty walls that are near these spaces, which could have murals, artwork done, statues put up, things like that, which is interesting, statues, if you think about it, right? But a lot of these questions, the answers I see came in the form of bringing natural elements into these space, like a waterfall feature, bringing art, so the visual, the oral, you know, using all of the senses. And so that really informed, now we have a master plan for that, where in the next 2 years, that space is going to be transformed into an Indigenous learning place, that where there'll be a central, you know, a fire, where a ceremonial fire can take place, where it'll be, there's a partially covered area to accommodate the natural elements in continuing to teach and learn outside. You know, all of these different things were incorporated into this to, I think, hopefully have a space that reflects some of, only very minimally, I would say, how we engage with the natural world, because that is so huge. There's so many different ways that takes place, right? And you can only bring so much into a place like a university setting, right? And I think that's where we're limited to, is money, of course, space, perceptions of land and land use, teaching outside, right? Things like that are not widely, are beginning to be acknowledged with land-based learning courses, right? But when you create these spaces on campus, we don't want these spaces to be just, you know, okay, we've done our job, great, it exists, it's colorful, it's got the medicine wheel on it, and there we go. It actually is a space where we engage, where community should be formed, you know, where critical engagement takes place, you know, all of the different things that are about who we are, where we can begin to express ourselves in a way that is familiar to us as Indigenous peoples. So that's just one thing that, among many, that we're doing.
I love it. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Riley?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I have certainly less teaching experience, but I am thinking, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the places. I'm like, well, then where do I learn best?
Yeah.
And for me, you know, I was thinking of examples of like teachings I've gotten or lessons that I've had that I like are stick so well. And I think about then, okay, what was the environment around me like, and how did it contribute to making it stick well? And I think the thing that is constant about all of those examples I could come up with was that more so than anything about like, you know, the art in the walls or like, you know, all of those things, was that it was set up in a way to most effectively facilitate us sharing and making space. And so like, I think that there's a lot of literature around the way that, you know, like having desks in lines, like facing front and all those things like are really counterintuitive to, you know, how people learn, to building communities. And so when I think about the places that I have learned best, it's always like, in the teepee around the fire, I think of a lot of ceremony. I think about even classrooms, you know, where the teacher made a very concerted effort to set us up in like small little communities and hubs and places like that. And the intimacy of that and the openness of that was something that, you know, was totally transformative in terms of, you know, the approach to learning. And as I say this, I note that the examples that are coming to mind of professors in my university career who have done this have always been in my Indigenous studies courses. And it truly, and, funnily enough too, right, even like Indigenous folks, from not only Turtle Island, like I had a professor who's now one of my supervisors. His name is YK Amaile, and he's Hawaiian. And that classroom and just the centering of Indigenous ways of doing things and going around in like a circle, making sure everybody had a chance to do it, set really clear boundaries from the beginning, and then was saying that the way we're going to work in this space is like a living thing, was really, really transformative. And so I think that might be like a core bit.
No, I agree with you. It's all about the spaces in which we find ourselves, right? And when we're going back to the original question around, well, how do you make the space? What do we need to think about? When I go into different spaces, I'm always aware, what is impacting me, what is impacting my senses, right? Because we associate smells with certain things, with certain teachings, or history, or even our own family. There's multiple ways that we experience the world. And so, how can we change these environments to reflect that engagement with the world with all of our senses, right? How do we make the changes necessary so that also we can teach others how to do that as well, how to teach in those spaces, or how to engage their students using all of their senses, right? Because, and that's a fundamental and a big question, because then you're asking, the university to change itself, to change how people teach and how people engage with knowledge, right? And I find that the younger professors are much more open to shifting and changing how they do things. So those are the ones that ask me, well, how do you do consensus-based decision making? Can I use it in my classroom? What can I use it for? And then in my experience going through university with older professors, it was always, they lecture at you, you sit in the audience and you sit in the class and you take your notes and you ask your questions and you take it home and you study those notes and you write your papers and then you write your exam and you hand in your paper and voila, you're graded and that's it, right? But no, it's not like that. When you're in the natural world and you're walking through, a forest, let's say, your senses are on high alert, right? Your eyes, your ears, the smell, everything. And so how can we translate that into these places that are here, or how do we facilitate more learning like that in the spaces that are created for us to teach in, to live in, to engage in, right? Those are big questions, but I think that's the gist of what we're asking here and what we're talking about here.
That's wonderful. Thank you. There is certainly a line of architectural investigation that is very concerned with the sensory experience of spaces. It's called phenomenology or called different things in different specters, but it's something that doesn't have a lot of mainstream traction. But certainly a number of, especially up and coming people are very interested in it, both architects and professors. And listening to you and understanding and listening to your examples, what's becoming very clear is that kind of this important idea of removing hierarchy is one of the very first steps, in addition to visioning. But removing hierarchy. And I listened to you use the word indigenize, and I wanted to understand it more. And I kept thinking about it, and I kept wondering, well, in order to indigenize, do we not have to decolonize? Right? Before, like, I don't know, maybe before, maybe at the same time, but I feel like that there needs to be kind of a more of a dynamic relationship, a more kind of unapologetic undoing, right? Recognition of what's wrong and not trying to just put on top of it, but spatially talking literal walls, right? But
Yeah.
starting to remove, right? A parallel that comes to my mind is often, unfortunately, in a lot of literature and media, they'll refer to the global south as the developing world. So just think about that, the developing world.
Yeah.
Well, these developing countries are all, in fact, former colonies, right? And so maybe a better term would be the recovering world, right? So recovering from colonization. And, there are entire countries all over the world struggling with how to recover and what the mechanisms are. And we are no different. Right? And I just think about these two ideas coming together as we think about uncolonizing as well as indigenizing, because if it's only indigenizing, all the work is on you. I cannot begin to fathom the pressure that's been on your shoulders to speak on behalf, to work on behalf, to do all of this, right? And we in the audience, many of us, or hopefully all of us, are allied folk, and we want to be a part of the work, right? And so that part of the work, maybe not in the indigenized part, but could come from the decolonized part, at least, as we become aware.
What if we rethink the term? So I encountered this yesterday. I went to Akwesasne for a meeting, and I brought, we ended up having this discussion around knowledge and knowledge transfer in different ways. We were at the Native North American Traveling College, and Naomi Bird works with me. She's my research facilitator as part of Onoko Indigenous Research Institute. And she brought up the term localize instead of indigenize. Why can't we localize, right? Which I think is interesting in terms of the fact that it broadens the thinking, it broadens the perspective to include you.
Yeah.
Right? How do you localize?
Yeah.
And what does that mean? So if we remove the term indigenize, which is something that I've had a problem with for quite some time, and we rethink that and revision it as something that is more an inclusive process. But what is that process? It's making local, right? And local means different things to different people. For me, I think about the very first thing that I thought about when she said this term was, standing on the ground in my bare feet, right? Feeling the earth and the energy of the earth come through me. To me, that's localized. That's doing that. I'm making myself familiar with the natural world, right? But for others, it means something different. And I think it's more, if we rethink that, it's more of an inclusive way to look at this. And in terms of decolonizing something, it even encompasses that, I think, right? So, I propose that, we rethink the terms that we use, where the terms, like, for example, at Carleton, we use terms like the Carleton community. We use inclusive language, because essentially that's what we're trying to do, is build a community, right? So with the Kinemagowan report, in there throughout it is terms, language around that is all about building that community of people, whether you are Indigenous or non-Indigenous, right? And so I think it's really important to think about the kind of language that we're using.
I appreciate that. That's wonderful. And Riley, your examples of kind of removing the hierarchy in the classroom was so impactful on you, and I'm sure impactful on others. And as you start to do this and start to share it, the effect multiplies, right? That there are ways to reconfigure the spaces we occupy, right? And with repeated use, not only does it become more common, but potentially start to enact actual change in the spatial world, right? Did you want to reflect any further on some of the ideas that Kahente was speaking about?
Sure. Oh, I see somebody bringing me another mug of water. Thank you. Very nice. I I'm gonna have to think of it again later. When I think about decolonization and indigenization, I really like Jesse Wente. If you know him from Canada Council of the Arts, who is often on CBC and is like brilliant. I really love his discussion about indigenization, because I was always taught where decolonization becomes most fallible is the fact that you can't decolonize things that are inherently colonial. So like you can't decolonize what's it called, colonial institutions. You can scrap those institutions to the entire ground and then build something totally new, but like that would be, you know, the only thing. There are certain things you can decolonize. Like there's a lot of talk about, like, you know, how to decolonize your mind, how to decolonize your relationships. Like these are things I certainly believe in, but then I wondered, and I always like felt really stuck about, okay, well, these structures, these systems, these institutions that are here and that we're not at least presently burning to the ground, you know, what do we do with them in this meantime? And that's where I think Jesse Wente's indigenization comes in. That could be really impactful, or at least it was for me, because he saw it as like a redefinition and a co-collaboration. So examples that he gave were about you know, the very famous Indigenous artist Kent Monkman. So he talks about how, like, you know, what he does is like Renaissance style painting. He does Renaissance style painting, but he uses Indigenous story and Indigenous perspective to be able to take that, what is a colonial medium, and derived from like obviously colonial roots, but he took it and he made it Indigenous. And in turn, he and Jesse Wente said, and I agree, you know, he made it better and he made it something more. And that's something that I think is really awesome. And he did the same thing he said about Jeremy Dutcher. You know, he sings opera, which is like, again, a very colonially derived thing, but then he sang it in Wolastoqey, and he made it more. And he had all of these examples of the way Indigenous people have and are, you know, not just lamenting the fact that some of the things that we have done and some of our ways of doing are gone. They're both fighting for those back and also redefining and co-collaborating and adding on to what colonialism has left us. And that, I think, is a really interesting and forward-thinking way of looking at indigenizing things.
That's wonderful. You've segued perfectly to my next question, unintentionally. So my next big question is, so in what ways can art or creative works of any sort start to amend history? Is it even possible?
That's big. That's putting a lot of the burden on art.
It's just a question if creative works or expressions can start to help to heal. Is it possible? And do you know of examples?
Oh, well, I have some. So these are, I do as part of my doctoral work, I took the Sky Woman story, and it came out of the work. I was doing interviews with women from Kahnawake, and in those interviews, they would talk about Sky Woman as though she was in the room. And I thought, well, I need to revisit the story. I knew it. You know, there were books and murals that exist in the community. And I thought, okay, so what is it about her that they're saying here? So as I revisited the story and read other versions of it, there's 32 of them, I think. There was still that disconnect. And so what I ended up doing was I sat down and I started to rewrite the story in the first person. So trying to place myself and see the world and her experiences through her eyes. And I ended up using knowledge that the women that I had worked with and that they shared with me to inform her life and her experiences. And so that story became the basis for my theory and method in my doctoral work. And then I took part of that and I was encouraged to tell it, essentially. And so The first performance that I did of that story was at Performing Turtle Island in 2014. And so out of that, I began to really think through, well, what does storytelling do, and how else can we transmit our culture? And so I began to think about tattooing the symbols of the Sky Woman story on my body. And so, you know, I have the sky dome, and I've got the three sisters, and I've got tobacco and the water, and then gradually I've added on to that the clan symbols, you know, created ones with my daughter, who's a tattooist. She does stick and poke. And these are all signifying, like, this is the Ahonta Gari Wadekwa. And so I've begun using these as teaching tools. So oftentimes people will say, oh, those are great, that's a great tattoo. And it's that crack in that doorway that allows me to throw it wide open and say, well, this is actually about my people. This is about me. This is about my family. This is about my role as a grandmother, you know, all these different things, these teachings that come out of, you know, the Guyana de Goa and the Longhouse. And so for me, it's not just art. I'm carrying the history of my people on my body, and I'm carrying the knowledge of my role among my people as a mother, as a grandmother on my body, right? And so art for me, it's in putting these on my body, it's transcending that. It's transcending the concept of art into embodied knowledge, right? And you know, that came through a progression of hearing and knowing the stories, sharing those stories with my children, but then moving through rewriting the story and rethinking it, and then performing that story, and then putting that story on my body, right? And then using that as a prompt to share that knowledge. And so, you know, I think there's a role to play. I think that could be an example of a process, right? That others might want to try as a way to change things, as you describe, or you pointed out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'd like at some point to be able to see the tattoos up close. It would be wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Riley, do you have any experiences or thoughts about the potentials of art or creative works?
I mean, I think about this a lot because to let you in on an insight of what could be like a past life, I suppose. When I was when I was first applying to university, I originally accepted an offer at OCAD for Indigenous art, and I was like, I'm going to be an artist. That's going to be the thing. And then I went to the Prime Minister's Youth Council, and I was like, oh, I guess politics is the thing. And so it switched me last minute, but I often wonder about like what life would have been like had I ventured down this path. And so I first of all, I want to say I really like one of the messages I got, Dr. Hornmiller, in your discussion, sorry for the motorcycle in the back, by the way, was, you know, it seems like art as preservation and passing on. And that I think is like, for sure, like one of the real powers of art as both, you know, tattoos or any other medium. Mm-hmm. But when I think about like the power of art to answer your question, like, I think first that one of the most pervasive things about colonialism that it does to uphold itself, right, is like perpetuating and creating and always recreating like these mythologies, like about Canada, right? For example, we'll use the settler state, right? Like they give us these narratives about who they are, who we are as Indigenous people, how things came to be the way that they are, how things should be. And so these are narratives that we're inundated with every single day. And so art can, of course, have many, purposes and meanings. But I think, a lot of Indigenous art, especially, is a very active form of resistance and a direct attack on those mythologies and those narratives that Canada tries to tell us, right? Like when we make Indigenous art, we are saying and building entire new futures, entire new worlds. We are modeling alternatives. And so that is in direct opposition to everything that Canada and colonialism tells us is the truth. And that's destabilizing, right? And I think that's it's super powerful. And so it's why there's a whole activist part of this. There's a whole reclamation part of it, and I think it very directly, very actively does that work. The other thing I think about it is in a country like we are in, where we are surviving an active genocide, art is one of the things that has been proven again and again and again to be life-sustaining. And I think about the way that there's a very common or popular slogan about my existence is resistance. And it's true, the way that Indigenous people continue to exist in spite of the violence of colonialism is a very active resistance. It's a very powerful thing. And, art for so many folks is, and always has been for many Indigenous nations, one of the ways that we made that resistance happen. And our communities have always used art and always been artists from the very beginning. I often actually think about the Mohawk and the Haudenosaunee. When I think about artists, I look at those wampum belts and I'm like, my God, carving out those shells by hand to make every single bead, incredible, right? And I think that is an act of sustaining life. And yeah, that's important for, destabilizing, making futures and building alternatives, for sure.
A very good
Thank you.
example is the warrior flag, right? The Mohawk warrior flag. You see that flying at every rallying point and rallying. It's a rally cry towards, it's empowering for people, Indigenous people, to see that. And it originally was a painting. It was a piece of political art.
Well, after I asked the question, I felt bad. I shouldn't have used the word art, right? It's creative work, because the thing is, I teach a course, I teach a whole course called Sacred Places, where we look at sacred places all over the world throughout different times. And in many cultures, ancient ones especially, there isn't a separate category or word for art, because these things that we call art, the colonized world or whatever, the westernized world, in fact is just a part, is an integrated sacred aspect of life, right? Expression. It's a creative expression that you put a piece of yourself into this creative work as an offering, whether this thing is something you use or something you show or something you express, right? And that these creative works are part and parcel with life. And, I shouldn't have used the word art, because that immediately starts to categorize it when it used to be not categorized. And I love the way you talked about it, Riley, as really empowering as resistance, as destabilizing. It is something that's so pervasive, we don't take advantage of or really think about the power that these daily creative acts can have, and the extension of it. And just by limiting them or categorizing them isn't really doing justice, right? So related to that, I'm thinking, right? And I'd like you to reflect on, as we think about the impact of creative works, expression, there is now a sustained movement to remove works of art in certain places because of what they represent.
Yeah.
So how do we start to approach that? In thinking about it, in recognizing it, it's a loaded question, but we are talking about creative expressions. And I'm very curious, because we're talking about positive, proactive ones, whether they're stabilizing, destabilizing or not, but also in the reverse, the works that have had negative impact. right? Recognizing that.
Yeah.
Undoing it.
Well, this goes back to your comments about art itself, art being a Western concept, right? And when we think about statues, we think about, you know, pieces that are created that are about expressing Canada's nationhood, how it came to be, right? Using Western art forms is, you know, what happens when we remove those, and what is left in its space, what is left in that place. I think the void gets filled by the dialogue, which is a living thing, right? I've talked extensively about the importance of dialogue and discussion and critical engagement with each other and the processes that are involved in that. It's a living thing. It's beautiful. So is art. Art is beautiful in some ways, right? So I think, you know, we have to think about, well, do we really want to fill that void with another object, right? Or do we want to fill that void with the tools that our young people need in order to survive in this world, right? We're facing climate change. We're facing climate events. We're facing, you know, people are beginning to move around this planet because the earth is not able to sustain them. And so do we really need to think about replacing and removing art? What about the void that's filled should be that void that is left should be filled with the living tools that we need to survive and engage with each other and learn from each other so that we have a future here on this planet.
Yeah, I'm going to be sitting with that one. I think, oh man, I mean, the thing that always gets me about art in Canada, or a lot of art in Canada, is that, like, you know, what it says is like, who gets to have a history, who gets to have memory. And that's what I think about every time I see, you know, some bust of an old white guy I don't know, and like, or the ones I do know. And, you know, that's what I think about. It was always so compelling to me that up until, like, you know, I think it was like 2014, a third of Canadians still couldn't define for you what a residential school was. But the man who created residential schools gets to be cast in bronze. And then when you even dare say, take it down, you know, they're like, well, what about the history? I'm like, you don't remember the history anyway. You know, like, you don't remember it anyways. I'm like, and so when I think about the fact that these statues exist in the first place, the thing that I always think about is a lot of people will say, well, you know, this was the history. These were the big things at the time. And I'm like, and I think at the time, you know, that there were always people fighting against their injustice, fighting against this being cemented as the dominant thing that would be preserved into the future. There were always people who were doing that work. And so the fact that we allowed it to exist in the first place, and we allow it to continue to exist without, you know, truly proper recognition of the otherwise, what an injustice that is to all of those people who did that work and who did that fighting. And that's what I think about, you know, for a lot of, you know, these old colonial statues and stuff like that, which is what, you know, fills up, I think, a lot of this space in the conversation. I think about the way that there's such a fear, or at least a stated fear, that we're going to somehow forget. And I'm like, who's forgetting? Because I promise you it's not Indigenous people. I promise you Indigenous people are not forgetting. And we won't let you, right? And so I think that a lot of the justifications and the rationales we have for keeping a lot of Canadian art up in place, and colonial art more specifically up in place, is really just, you know, flimsy and weak attempts to uphold those narratives I was talking about in the last question. And so that's, I think that if we're going to recognize the true history, like I feel like there's nothing more I would love to see than like take down all the statues of Egerton Ryerson and put up a statue for residential school survivors in his place instead. And are true reclamations, and I think are necessary in this path to justice.
Incredible. Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. There's so much to think about. And I truly appreciate the feedback from both of you and your wonderful kind of experiences that you've generously shared with us. And I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has any questions that for either of our guests this evening. And I can check the chat really quickly.
Mhm.
Just me forgetting my charger.
Yeah, if there's any questions from the audience. Okay, I'll let the audience kind of think about it a bit, see if there's anything, please share it with us. And, you know, I'm going to circle back. So what I'd like to do is just circle back to somewhere where we started near the beginning. And that's this idea of moving away from the quote unquote status quo. Right? And all of the mechanisms. And you've generously shared with us many mechanisms and many paths, hard-won lessons to carve your own space out, to challenge the status quo, to express it. What further can allied folk do to support that?
I've been thinking through with allies and friends at Carleton, you know, what does allyship mean? What are some of the things that need to be thought about? And I think one of them is knowing when to step back. Just know when to step back and let Indigenous people speak for ourselves. Let us speak for ourselves. Let us do some of the work. And when we need your help, we'll let you know, right? Because oftentimes you have situations where allied folks will speak on behalf, right? And I find that problematic. And so I think it's an act of stepping back and being a support, being supportive of what we are trying to do as Indigenous peoples, right? That's just one thing. You know, but thinking through what does it mean to be an ally? I think often about, you know, the land acknowledgements. We've been doing them for a few years now, and oftentimes they become almost rote, you know, where people will, you can almost see their eyes rolling in the back of their heads going, okay, here we go, don't forget to do the land acknowledgement. And they'll say the same words every time without feeling, right? And I think what's important is for allies to understand where their feet are on the ground. And instead of doing these land acknowledgements, acknowledge where they are standing, and take it from a personal expression of, I am here in unceded Algonquin territory. I am Ganyakahaga. I come from Gahnawaga. My mother is from there. I have 4 children and I have a granddaughter, and we live here in Algonquin territory. We are guests, and we are mindful of that as we engage in our daily lives on this other nation's territory. To me, that's a land acknowledgement, and that's what allies should do, is acknowledge their feet on the ground in the place that they're living and working, right? So those are 2 things. And I think those, when we hear people in the room express that, it means so much more, and you know who you can go to because they understand where they're standing. They feel it, right? So those are 2 suggestions.
Yeah. I love that you brought in a conversation about allyship, because it gives me an opportunity to quote Jesse Wente once more, who, as you can tell, I'm obsessed with. But he talks about, you know, how he likes there to be a difference from allyship and a move towards what he would either called accomplicehood, but I've also heard called co-conspirating, which I really like. And the idea is that allyship can become for so many people, and I think Dr. Horn-Miller really touched on this, the way it can become a very passive thing, and become a thing that is just like, I support you, and like I'll just echo back what you're saying. Whereas accomplicehood or co-conspirating, it really connotes a more active present role.
Yeah.
And the thing about that I think is really that I've heard people say is like, I don't need supporters. I need people who are willing to be race traitors, who are willing to disavow the systems that actively benefit them in pursuit of building new ones that might not benefit them to such a degree. And that is something that I think is really profound, right? When I think about challenging the status quo, only when I know that somebody's willing to put their self and their body and their privilege on the line in the same way that I am for members of my own community, do I trust them enough to build a relationship where I can let them in on the alternate ways of doing, the alternates to the status quo that already exist, right? That I know that there are different ways of doing governance, of doing climate change, of climate action, of doing a whole host of just being in the world. But that information and that project is something I only undertake with people that I trust. So I think that there's an element of active participation, of relationship building in there, of what's it called? Just being able to put yourself on the line. And so I think that if people were able to do that, we would have a way more fulsome understanding of what alternatives are actually presently existing and being implemented that counter the status quo, because Indigenous people do know those ways. So, yeah.
Yeah. Great.
That's wonderful. Thank you. And, and a lot of it is, and I appreciate so much both of your comments, because a lot of it is undoing embedded biases, right? Undoing that and then being proactive beyond that to kind of challenge things and become more better allies. But I do very much appreciate also your comments, Kahente, about being on the ground, putting yourself more into the land acknowledgement. That resonated with me, right? Finding a way to put yourself more within it, not be afraid to be personal.
That's right.
I think I'll acknowledge I'm afraid of. So that's something I want to do and I want to work on because it is important, right? And listening to you speak about that really struck me quite profoundly. So I thank you for that. I appreciate it. We have in the chat, someone has shared with us a comment that I'll read. Ani, more of a comment than a question. I have a scan of a map of Mindu Missing Manitoulin Island with all of the original Ojibwe names and would love to share them with the three of you if anyone would be interested. Fabulous discussion, by the way. And that's from Carrie Corbier. Thank you. And the answer is yes, please. I live in Sudbury, so Manitoulin is, I'm privileged to be able to go often and to know people there. So the famous artist Carl Beam, his wife Anne Beam is also a prolific artist and she's a supporter of the school. And since we first founded, she hosted us at her studio and has been at our events. And I'm fortunate to discover this incredible paradise that's called Manitoulin. But the answer is yes for me.
I'm always about place names, I'm telling you.
Yes.
I'd love to.
Yeah, Manitoulin strikes me as belonging to another world. Even the drive from Sudbury, it radically changes once I cross that bridge into Little Current. And then I just feel like I'm in a literal different geography. Everything about it is awe-inspiring. Thank you. We have a question from Alexandra Lynn. I loved what you said about tattoos as carrying the history and the roles of your ancestors.
Mhm.
and they are gorgeous. Are there other ways you see the body as a tool of resistance and storytelling? Thank
Mhm.
you, Alexandra. That's a fantastic question.
Absolutely. And that's something I've done some thinking and writing about. There's a book that the participants at the Performing Turtle Island were asked to contribute to. So in the years after I did that first performance, and when I was doing other performances of the story, I would think and keep note of the audience's response and also how I was communicating the story. And I think, using our bodies become a vessel for carrying people when we're telling these stories of our origins. We begin to use our bodies through movement, song, and dance. And this is what I do. And when I do the story, I find that I characterize it as carrying the listener and the audience into the sky world, or into our understanding our perspective of the world and the natural world through the story, hearing the story, but also I'm carrying them through my tone of voice, through my eyes, through my body movements, through the songs that I sing. And so I think in there, when we are conscious about how we are telling these stories of our history, the stories of our ancestors, even now the stories of our families, when I talk about my children or my grandchildren, and I tell stories about what they're doing, I'm conscious of the tone of voice that I'm using. I'm conscious of my body movements, right? And I think those are ways that signal others in an unsaid way, right? They provoke one. Like I said, Jini Jiwa, the whole thing about history and teaching and telling stories is to make it alive in the mind. And so the way that we do that is through our voices and through the body movements. And where I learned this is in the Longhouse. So when we have speeches that are done by the ones that hold those words for funerals or for ceremonies, for our festivals, what they'll do is they'll use their entire body to communicate. So it's not only the words, it evokes thoughts, and you can see these things that they're talking about in your mind, and you can feel them, and they connect us better to each other when we're there, and they connect us better to the natural world. So when we do things like the Ahanta Gari Wadekwa, which is the words that come before all else, we are seeing what they are talking about, our relationship to all the elements in the natural world. And so it's using the body and the tone of voice to help communicate that and connect one, so that one sees it, and therefore one feels it, right? And I think if we think about resistance and storytelling, acknowledging that, and acknowledging how our stories have been flattened on the paper, in the books, right? They've been flattened. And so using our bodies, we can remove them and bring them up off the page and back into life, so that they become powerful again, and a way to fight colonization and resist, and so on.
If I could just jump in, because I'm like sitting here, I'm like, oh, so good. But as when this question came up, I know it's directed to you, but it made me think of this thing. I don't know if any of you have heard it, called ancestral mathematics, where they talk about, it's just like, I'm sure I probably saw this on like Tumblr back in the day or something, but every time, but I saved it and like I come back to it because it just like makes me so emotional. Is that like, you know, in the ancestral mathematics says like in order to be born, like you needed 2 grandparents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, and it goes on and on and on. And then it basically ends up with saying for you to be born today from only like 10 previous generations, you need almost 5,000 ancestors to get here. 4,094, I think is the right answer. But so then they ask you to like think for a moment, like how much history is there? How many struggles? How many battles? How much sadness? How much happiness? How many love stories? How many expressions of hope for the future in nearly 4,000, 100 people. And then when I think about that, I'm just like, like because it's profound, because it's immense. The number, is probably beyond my own comprehension.
Mhm.
And so with that, like you just think about how much there is there that came to get you to this point, and for you to be able to like live in this body. And it's something that, for me is really like humbling and really revolutionary in terms of the way that I think about like what this body represents and what it does for me, and what it does for my communities. And so, yeah, I love me some ancestral mathematics.
I really began to understand that when I had my first grandchild. Because it's not your child, but it's another generation, right? Beyond the next generation. And so for me, I think when you start to have children, you can begin to visualize that kind of ancestral mathematics and the implications of it. Like I think about my mother, who's almost 82, right? And that is her first great grandchild. And I think about all the dynamics and all the stories and all the happiness and all the sadness and all the, sister fights and cousins, getting into trouble and doing good things and going to concerts and all of this stuff that's going on. And that's just, that's my mother, us, our children, and then my grandchild, right? And so that's only like 4 generations. And there's so much. So, right, you think about the ancestral mathematics and how huge that is. I mean, when I'm talking about with my family is like this, and it's really big, but you begin to understand that when you start to have children, or when you look back and you go, and if you're really close to your family and you can understand and you can see and you've been around long enough to understand the intergenerational, things that have gone on and the stories and all of that have passed down to you, it becomes more vivid.
Yeah, very powerful concept and a bit overwhelming.
Yeah.
As you were explaining it, I was like, right. I've always thought about it in the reverse, right? How people propagate, right? You never think about it in this perspective. And then thinking about the question from Alexandra, which I really appreciated, are there other ways that you see the body as a tool of resistance and storytelling? And I'm wondering, just thinking about it, the body will always be a political space, right? How you express it, we come back to the very beginning of the conversation when Kahente was talking about making space in a diplomatic, unapologetic. That's your body. That is you making space, right? How we express ourselves is always a political act, right? And of the stories, we hear of the stories, we exist in the stories of how we normalize ourselves within, Western constructs, right? And so by expressing who we actually are, our body becomes the first location of resistance, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious and Kante, you generously shared with us your tattoos, and both of you have spoken about the power of storytelling and using your body for that. Are there other mechanisms or approaches that you can think of as well?
Having names.
Yeah.
Those are So my mother was one of the first ones in Kahnawake to begin giving Kanyageha names to her children as instead of English names, right? And our names are supposed to be individual to us. So my name Kahente is not supposed to belong to anybody else. Unfortunately, it does. But we do have a mechanism, if you're Longhouse, for taking back the name, because only one person is supposed to have that name for their life. And when they pass on the name, there's actually a ceremony that they do where they will take that name back and give it back to the clan, right? But that name references your birth experience. So mine is Gahande, means she walks ahead, because I was born 2.5 months early. And so they had to think about, well, what is the name that would reflect my experience in this world, right? And how I came to be here. And so with my own children, I have done the same thing where each one of them has a name that, and I'm not going to say their name because our names have been appropriated and they've been used in books and movies and things. And I've refused to give my kids names because of that, because I don't want them to be appropriated with this recording. There's a high chance that's what will happen again. So we give my sisters and I, we give our children Kanyageha names, and they walk through life, using those names and making the space, even in elementary school, where, the teachers and other students will say, well, do you have a nickname? And we have always learned through our growing up, to teach others our names. Say, no, we don't have nicknames. If you want to know me, you have to learn my name. And so we've done that with our children, where they say, no, I don't have a nickname, but here, I'll teach you how to say my name. And so once again, they're learning how to create that space, right? And I think that is another way that we can do this, is by giving, using our language, our own languages and our own naming practices to create those spaces, to move through life with the names that speak about us as individuals in this world, but also as parts of communities of people that are still living, because that's really what this does, right? Is it using Kanyageha names or using indigenous names really says that we are still here, right? And even the very fact, like what Riley said in the very beginning, birthing these children, we weren't meant to survive. All of the things that have been put in place, through policies like the Indian Act, were meant for us to die out. And the very fact that we are having children and we are giving them Kanyageha names or Cree names or Algonquin names, instead of English names, is an act of sovereignty. The very fact that they are here and they have a Kanyageha name, and my children are here and they know who they are, is an act of sovereignty. The very moment that I push them out of my body, right, that's an act of sovereignty.
My goodness. Yeah. I'm like, I'm so envious in a way of the conversations around names. Always I get like my little green head up, because my family or my community is heavily born again Christian. They were really heavily missionized. And so we had a real like dearth of traditional like knowledge and culture accessible to us, even on the res, which is a whole other conversation, because I think a lot of people think like the res is like this hub of like cultural knowledge and indigeneity. But so yeah, I've always like been waiting and talking to folks about how to get it to get a name. And in Anishinaabe culture, the name, like you get 3 different ones: one when you're born, one when you hit puberty, and then one later on in life, I think when you get married or when you move out of the house, because it's supposed to set your path for life going forward at each stage. So like I'm like, I need to know my path, you know. So I really am thinking about that one now. But just to add on to the question that you asked, Dr. Gaber, I think about the way like about what the body can do, and like I not maybe it's a convoluted answer, but is that like I think about these things like, you know, ableism and fat phobia and all of these structures that really serve to penalize certain bodies. And I think about the way that those were not present, at least in like my culture when, or in my nation, in the way that they are now. And how the way that those have been so internalized by folks to be standards and to be systems of prejudice and oppression, like is a direct reflection of colonialism. And so like over the past few years, I like really have sat down and tried to build a lot of solidarities with fat folks, with disabled folks, with other people who like Indigenous people whose bodies are you know, targeted just for existing. And I see that, you know, it's such a colonial thing for us to not work through those things and to you know, unlearn them, because I'm not only when I still hold those beliefs, I'm not only, you know, hurting a person, I'm also letting colonialism win. Like I'm perpetuating those belief systems and those structures that they want me to uphold, and that they imposed on me. And so I think about not only, of course, then my own body, but how incumbent it is on all of us to like really interrogate and tear down those structures that you know, target any body as, you know, a real act of decolonization. And those are one of those places where I think decolonization can actually come in and be, you know, something very real. And so, yeah, that's what I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years. I have luckily had such like incredible like mentors and like loved ones and community members who like have guided me and walked me through this. And so their like solidarity work, I think is like inextricable for any of the conversations we've really been having today.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It's so much food for thought. I really appreciate that. Thank you both so much. Does anyone else in the audience have any further questions or comments that they'd like to share with our guests this evening?
I would love a question.
Yes, you have a question?
No, I said I would love one, but
oh, okay.
I have.
It's amazing that we can talk about such hard subject matter, and yet there's still space for us to rejoice, right? And that's something that is an act, an intentional act, I think, is to also reclaim space as well. So I am very much appreciative of your good nature, both of you, and your generosity in your good nature to share with us really difficult things, difficult ideas, but still find place to laugh with us as we're working through all of this.
Laughter is really balancing. That's what it does. I don't know about you, Riley, but when you go to funerals, right, and there's people laughing, there's always, you know, people telling stories and laughter, and for me, that's what I see when I go to funerals in my communities. And I thought about that, you know, and there are non-Indigenous people that will come to these funerals as part of the community or supportive or whatever. And they get at first they're offended because they don't usually hear laughter at funerals. But at our funerals, there's lots of that, lots of joking. And, you know, I spent some time thinking about this and writing about it, actually. And I came to understand that actually humor is very balancing, and it's actually medicine. We have gajisas in the Longhouse that come and they make people laugh during the Midwinter Festival, because it's a way to, because the Midwinter is, you know, for us, it takes place in early February, and it's our ceremony that marks the new year. And so at the beginning of the festival, you turn the ashes and you're putting away all the things that you went through that year, right? And you're acknowledging, yes, it was hard. Yes, there's lots of things that went on, but I'm still here and I'm still surviving, and I have to look forward now to the next year. And so the gajisas come in as part of the healing part of the whole ceremony, the 4 days, where they make you laugh and you give them candy and they dance and they do weird and crazy stuff. And to me, it's medicine. We recognize it as medicine, where we have to laugh, even in the most difficult times and having the most difficult conversations. It's really important to continue laughing, because that's what balances our minds, and that's what balances our relationships to each other.
Yeah, you're putting a whole new spin in my mind on like, this is, so for folks who might not know, like, I think there's like a real common like trope, or maybe it's just an observation, like within a lot of Indigenous communities, about like, the aunties and like the auntie laugh being like one thing, like whatever, like it's so boisterous and like so just like infectious and all these things. And so like the idea, and so that's why for me, like one of the reasons I think for me why, like, and laughter, yes, I agree, such medicine. And so this idea that I think it's always like a badge of honor when somebody calls you an auntie, like I'm like, really? And so you've made me think about how those two are related, and I love it. I think it's really, really good.
Wonderful. We have one more question, and I'm mindful of the time. Thank you, Federica Goffi. We have a question. What is your idea of storytelling, and what is the word for it or concept in your languages for it? And what does it mean? Thank you for sharing your stories and thoughts with us.
Yeah. Well, I use the term Jini Jiwa. So how I came to understand this in this way was I asked my mother one time. She's a fluent Ganyagaha speaker, and I was thinking through, I was writing something. I said, Ma, do we have a word for history? And this is what she does. She'll say, okay, well, let me think about this. I'll get back to you. So I waited, a couple days. And then she goes, I've been thinking about this word. And so we sat down and she started to take the word, and it was slightly different. And what she'll do is she'll pull it apart, and then she'll say, okay, this means this means this, and this means this. And then she'll put it back together. And then she'll say, and this is what I think that concept means. And then she'll go, wait, and she'll pull it apart again. And then she'll change it slightly and it'll shift a bit. But the final word that she came up with was Jini Jiwa. And she says, really, it's not, we don't have a word for history. We don't have a word for storytelling, but we do have a concept that talks about what happens. And that's when we share history, or we do this, we tell these stories, right? Is that we are making them alive. We are making this knowledge alive in the mind. And so this word, Jini Jiwa, could be applied to the idea of storytelling, could be applied to the ideas around history and communicating history, right? In its multiple ways. And, going back to the art, right? Isn't that what art does? The visuals, it visually communicates us, it connects us visually to ideas, right? Because we're seeing it, or we're hearing it, or we're smelling it, or we're tasting it, the multiple ways that we do, right? So that's our word.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh my God. You, what's it called? The life part is what I was going to say. So like, I think, I don't know an actual direct translation for storytelling in Anishinaabe Moan. Ojibwe is the direct dialect that I speak. But when I read the question, the first thing that came to my life is like, so I'm writing my first book right now. And for anybody who's written a book, you'll know like what a labor it is, like what a consuming process it is. And so I'm writing this book, and like this summer, you know, with COVID, and I just moved like to a whole different province, and so I was in Newfoundland before this Mi'kma'ki, so I haven't gotten to write as much as I really would have liked to, and like I was so upset about this one day, and I was talking to my partner, and I was like, I just can't write, and I'm really far behind, and like all these things, and they said to me, they were like, you know, like when you're writing, and you've said this to me before, Riley, like you're bringing something to life, and like, would you rush anybody else in their process of bringing life into the world? Like, you know, nobody tells people to like give birth faster, like, you know, obviously.
Unless you want to die an early death.
Exactly. So like, and they were like, my goodness, like, you know, like that's a process you can't rush. And it made me feel so much better, and offered, I think, like such a good perspective. And the word for life in Ojibwe, and it's similar in Cree, is bimatsuin. And so you might hear it often tied to mino bimatsuin, which means to live the good life, or to live a good life. And so bimatsuin would be the word that I can think of being alive.
What a beautiful way to end today's session. I love this. Thank you so much for sharing everything and these powerful words with us as we be, as we live, as we are alive. These are so, so beautiful. And thank you so much for writing that in the chat. And there's so many thanks here from the audience. If you want to just take a look at the chat, members of the audience have written some very kind words of thanks. Thank you everyone for being here. And thank you, DWG. What a rock star group. I can't believe you're barely a year old. You're a year and a half old. You're engendering important conversations that need to happen and bringing people together to talk about really important spaces and ideas, and making spaces in this way. And I just want to thank DWG for hosting us. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, if any of our guests want to add any closing comments. But thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I think we had a member that wanted to just kind of just take care of some housekeeping stuff.
Sure.
But if anyone else has any other comments.
Just to say miigwech, and bamapi. We don't have a word for goodbye. It means see you soon.
Yeah. Nyawat goa. Nyawat goa and onagiwahi.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Joe. So on behalf of DWG, Riley, Kahente, and Tammy, thank you so much for sharing your insights and teachings with us tonight. We know the stories you shared tonight were quite personal, and we really appreciate this and the discussion you were able to facilitate. We honestly have no words besides thank you. It was just an honor to learn from you tonight. In addition, DWG would also like to give our thanks to everyone who was able to attend today's event, and the School of Architecture for advertising and supporting this event. This lecture is recorded and will be posted on our website for everyone's future reference. But other than that, we hope you enjoyed the lecture tonight, and have a great night.